Howdy. I've got a new series, first one on this channel that I'm going to start, and actually a new channel, called Bridge Forward. This series is going to be over WPF, or Windows Presentation Foundation. This is the first episode overview, and our mantra is one step at a time, one rep at a time, let's bridge forward. So I'm going to keep this episode really short. This is going to be constrained to just the high-level overview of WPF. That way you can make a decision on if it's worthwhile to pour more time into learning it, or if you want to dig into it some more after this episode. So high-level overview, this is what we're going to discuss. What is WPF? The pros and cons. Who uses it? What companies? What products? Things like that. And that all leads you to the question of, well, okay, great. Now that I know that, should I learn it if you don't already use it? Then we can review a Hello World example. Nothing complicated. I will just likely create a Hello World file or project in Visual Studio, get it running and talk through some key points, but we won't really do any coding in this episode. I'm going to save that for when I actually begin the rest of the series and we start working on a sample application. And then the last thing that I'll cover is the overall plan for the series. And in hindsight, actually, I may skip from the should I learn it to plan for the series and then go to the example. So that way I can keep it all into PowerPoint in the beginning, and then we can jump over into Visual Studio. So with that being said, let's move on to what is WPF. The high-level summary, you may recognize some of the icons in the top right. Those are very popular tools and languages. So the first one is Visual Studio. Most folks are at least familiar with what that is if you have a background in software development or anything like that. And even if not, you may be familiar. And if you are familiar with that, then you likely have heard of C# programming language. Maybe less familiar with Visual Basic, a different programming language. Limited in scope, not used as much, at least as far as extensive software development goes, though it does have some use in like Excel macros and things like that. Maybe something that you think of when you hear Visual Basic. And last but not least is XAML, XAML, the Extended Application Markup Language. Think of this like a derivative of HTML, hypertext markup language. It's just a syntax for describing the structure of a page or a screen, or how you want to present data to the user. You're just outlining what kind of grids and rows and where you want certain elements on the screen. So WPF stands for Windows Presentation Foundation. It was originally, back in the heyday, a Microsoft product that they developed, but has since been open sourced and is maintained by the open source community. I think there's actually a foundation, Windows Presentation Foundation, but a separate foundation that maintains it as opposed to Microsoft, who did back in the day. The development environment that you're going to use is almost certainly going to be a Visual Studio, not VS Code or Emacs or Vim or Notepad++ or some other IDE. And I'll explain that in the pros and cons section some more, but just know that you'll most likely be using Visual Studio. Already touched on the programming languages, but specifically most people in my, at least empirically what I've seen, is it's almost certainly going to be C#. Most people do not use Visual Basic, though I believe that's an option still. Most WPF applications are going to use the combination of C# and XAML. So C# is going to be your business logic. and actually manipulating data, that kind of thing. And your XAML is your markup or your presentation layer. As far as tooling and frameworks, we already touched on it, but Visual Studio is the main tool that you'll use to edit and compile and run your application. Some other common libraries and frameworks are used, like Entity Framework. So you may use EF Core or something as your ORM, or Object Relational Mapper. And all that means is it's a library that helps you map objects in your code, your WPF application, to items that may be in a database, for example. So you'll have a class and then an object, so an instance of that class that has a bunch of properties or data associated with it. And you want to map those properties to a database table or other information in a database. And Entity Framework helps you with that. And then as far as databases go, WPF is a standalone application. So you're going to traditionally give your customer, which may be internal or a paying customer, an executable to run on their computer, and they're just going to run it like they would Word or Excel or something like that. They're not going to go to a website to access the WPF application. So because of that, you regularly see people use local databases that they run on the machine alongside the application, as opposed to having to connect back to some database server. The pro of using a standalone database like SQLite would be that you can have totally offline use of your application. So if I don't need to share my data with anyone, then I can give my client an application and they can run it and install it on a computer that doesn't have internet access, which is one pro of using WPF, and one potential niche use case why you would use that over, say, a web framework like a JavaScript based application in the web. But that being said, especially for business applications, there is a need to access database servers, because I may have a 200-person company and they may all need to write data to a common location, in which case you will use a database server like Microsoft SQL Server, PostgreSQL, MySQL, etc. And the WPF application has no issue interfacing with the database. It can do that as well. I already mentioned deployments, but specifically it's primarily Windows-based computers that WPF is deployed to. Originally, I don't think that was an option. I think it was like you will deploy to Windows machines or you won't use WPF. In recent years, there has been a push with .NET especially to support cross-platform scenarios. So you actually do have the option of deploying WPF apps to like Linux computers, for example. I will say the support is not the same that you will get with Windows deployments, but it is out there. And I have written an app, specifically I'm calling out here Avalonia UI, is the framework that you will use to cross-compile for a Linux target. So you'll develop the application in Avalonia UI. Back in the day when they were still maintaining multiple .NET baselines, there was .NET Framework, .NET Standard, .NET Core. .NET Core was, as far as I remember, the only one that would run on cross-platform environments. So when you developed your app, you actually had to make sure you selected .NET Core. Those have all been deprecated, and now it's just .NET. I think they just call it .NET and then the version now. I think they've gotten rid of all the other nomenclature. And that should be cross-platform. That should support cross-platform use cases. So moving on to our next slide. I started touching on pros and cons already, but I want to cover them a little bit more in depth just for a minute, keeping this high level as an overview, but giving you enough information to make a decision on if you really want to learn WPF or use it for a project that you may be considering. So what's funny, you may notice that I've put XAML in the pro column as well as the con column. Now, subjectively, I am a huge fan of C#. It is my favorite programming language, and I really do enjoy using XAML as well. So I actually consider that a pro for using WPF. However, XAML was originally developed for WPF as far as I'm tracking, so it's not like something, it's not like HTML or another markup language that has a ton of adoption, and you can use HTML with, pretty much any JavaScript framework out there and it's going to work. XAML is really limited to WPF applications and other apps like building Avalonia apps or UWP, Universal Windows Platform, I believe, is something else that Microsoft has developed to meet kind of the same need as WPF, but there's some differences there that we can get into in a UWP series. And Maui UI is another cross-platform C# based framework for developing desktop applications. That's really about it for using XAML. However, I will say it is not very complex. It is very similar to other markup languages. So if you're already familiar with HTML, you're going to have no issue using XAML. It's not going to be a big effort for you to learn. If you really have any familiar with any other markup language, then I don't think there's going to be a big barrier to entry there. So I will say it's mostly in the pro column, but know that it is different than some other application frameworks that you may not have to learn that as well. As far as the pros or benefits go, I mentioned this earlier, but you can deploy a self-contained application. So normally you will, when compiling your software, choose to include all of the dependencies in usually one file. It'll be your executable file. Sometimes you'll have to give a zip or something else, or you'll give an installer, and the installer will extract dependencies and DLLs and things like that. And this is all very common. But the bottom line is that you give everything that your customer needs to them so that they can run that application without having to reach back to a server or do anything like that. They have all the dependencies they need bundled in your installer to run your application, which is a pro. I didn't list it here, but a con to this kind of software is DRM, or digital rights management. Now that just describes a lot of things that go into managing rights to your application. Now, it used to be common practice that I would buy a license for a software. I would get a physical disk and an install key, and I would own that for forever, really, the rest of my life on whatever machine I installed it on. Now that model has gone largely away, and things have transitioned to a SaaS model, or a subscription-based model, subscription as a service, or software as a service, sorry. So that means that companies prefer to host their software in the cloud and require you to have internet access. That way they can consistently authenticate you, and if you ever choose to stop paying your subscription, they can cut off access to your software, or to their software. So when you give a customer an installer and they can run the stuff offline, digital rights management gets a lot more complicated, and there's less guarantee associated with it. You can still obfuscate your code, which means when you compile it, or after you compile it, I guess during the compilation step, you choose to make it a lot more complex than, and this is really keeping it very high level. I'm not getting into the details, so I'm overgeneralizing it, but when you obfuscate your code, when you're compiling, you're making it harder for someone to disassemble it or analyze it and find a weakness in it or bypass some licensing check or something that you may have, but that's not foolproof. So a motivated attacker with a physical access to a machine that has a self-contained install app like a WPF application will, with enough time and resources, be able to bypass really any digital rights management you have. That being said, most people are not going to go to that effort, so it's usually not worth the cost associated with developing advanced DRM for a WPF app. And I'm kind of digging into the weeds here. This is really a separate conversation, but for the purposes of the overview, just know that in general, giving a self-contained application to your customer gives you less guarantee of keeping that customer, because you may have folks that bypass your security providing like cracked installers or tools that generate licenses for it, for example, and not have to pay for your software in that case. But do know that that is very rare, and should your application be successful, it's really a non-issue because people are always going to try to do that anyways, and you're going to have, we're talking about a fraction of your customer base that would even be attempting this kind of stuff. So just be aware that DRM is a consideration, but it normally shouldn't lead you down one path or the other. Understanding that there may be certain reasons why you would place more emphasis on it. So I kind of went down a little rabbit hole there, but hopefully there's some value. Just know that digital rights management, or DRM, is a consideration with these kinds of applications. Another pro that I have is a large community. So WPF is very popular and has been around for a long time. So there's a lot of libraries available to you, such as Infragistics for custom UI widgets that you can use to make your application look nicer, for example, and you can use their library. Some of them are paid though, like I believe Infragistics has a set of free icons, but or widgets, but at some point there is a paid tier, and sometimes it's just customer service that you're paying for. But know that there are a lot of resources out there. So in addition, in the form of tutorials and questions, I know Stack Overflow is losing popularity as far as I'm aware. I haven't really used it in years, but there's a lot of old questions on there that are still relevant today. And there's a lot of other articles and blog posts and YouTube videos like this one, for example, with people covering WPF basics. So if you choose to learn it, it's not like you're trying to develop your own programming language or build your own kernel and there's maybe a couple of books, like paperback books you have to go find and then still fill in a lot of gaps yourself. There's a lot of information out there and a lot of open source projects on GitHub, for example, that you can go look at and dig into. So finding the resources and information is not going to be a problem should you choose to invest in learning WPF. I mentioned this already, but second bullet point on the con side, even though there have been a lot of there's been a lot of progress made for cross-platform support for things like WPF, it still really is a Windows first mentality. So if you are developing an app that is only targeting Linux users for some reason, for example, then it may not be worth investing in WPF. You may want to look at alternatives that have a little bit more support for that target infrastructure or environment. That being said, there's almost a solution for every problem that you would run into, but you're going to find less information out there because, you know, by and large, most of the content and the tutorials and the resources are going to be for users that are developing WPF apps for Windows computers. So most of it will be the same, but there are some nuances when you're targeting the Linux environment that will be a little bit harder to find information and support for. So just know that going into this. And the last one, and this may be significant, is depending on your background. I put this in quotes, but it really requires Visual Studio proper, not VS Code or another editor like I mentioned earlier. Very technically, you could compile a WPF application without Visual Studio, the editor. I think you would still need maybe some of the dependencies of it, but you could work around that. And you could still edit your files in a different editor. For example, like I can modify a C# file in whatever editor I want. But you're really going to lose out on the debugging that is built into Visual Studio. The debugger at runtime attaches to the application process and lets you set breakpoints in the code, for example, and lets you analyze the value of certain properties in your source code at certain points in time. So there's a lot of benefits that come with using Visual Studio that you're going to have to jump through a lot of hoops and learn a lot in order to be able to develop WPF apps without using Visual Studio. So that's why I put requires in quotes. Really, 99% of people that develop WPF apps are going to be using Visual Studio for all of their work. They're going to use it for creating new files, modifying source code, actually compiling the software, running the software, the whole life cycle. There's, I think, integration with Git even, so it's almost all in Visual Studio. Now, if you're used to working on a different language like Java or JavaScript even, and using VS Code for that, then it may be a little bit different for you trying to transition to Visual Studio. So you'll have to learn the editor, which is kind of its own process. I personally love Visual Studio, so I enjoy working with WPF and Visual Studio, but it is another thing to learn. It is very feature rich, but with the extra features means you are having to learn how to use them in the editor, and you have to learn how to do dependency management, which is a little different. You use NuGet packages and the NuGet package manager. So that's another thing in addition, instead of using something like a Maven or NPM packages, your package list, the JSON file that you'd use, for example. So there's some extra things like that you have to learn. But if you did choose to learn WPF, I would recommend just use Visual Studio. I went through a period where I was trying to do everything in Vim, and I tried to compile WPF apps in the command line and get rid of Visual Studio, and it was way more work doing that than just using Visual Studio. And the editor really is great when it works well, which has gotten better over the years. So I'll leave it at pros and cons. I'll leave it there for the pros and cons and start talking about who uses it. So I mentioned the large community, and there really are a lot of WPF apps out there. There are a ton of them, but, and this is a huge but, most of those, in my experience, are internal apps for different businesses, all sizes, like small to large, especially the small to medium-sized businesses. But they use them for more controlled environments where they control the user's computer, for example, and I can just deploy a standard Windows image with all the dependencies I need to all of my employees and give them all of these applications. WPF is pretty popular there. Or if you need to develop an app for a specific business case and you're not going to give it externally to your customers, that's another common choice for that kind of application. I believe Visual Studio itself, the actual editor, is used or uses WPF, which is it's really cool to think about. And Evernote originally was a WPF application, though I believe they've since moved to a different framework other than WPF. So honestly, there are not a lot of major players in the client, or there are not many incredibly popular WPF applications for the average user. Things have migrated in the last decade or so to the web, and everyone is so used to going to their websites. Even on the phone, there was a move to deploy PWAs, so progressive web apps, which is really like an app icon on your phone that when you open it up, looks like an application, but it's really just a website that renders well on the phone, and they hide some of the features that make it look like a website, like the URL browser, URL portion, and things like that. Because it's easy to develop a website and have it be used on any target computer, because regardless of whether or not I'm using Windows or Linux or an iPhone or an Android, I'm going to have a browser that I can use to go to a website. And that browser is going to render the information pretty much the same way, pretty much, on all those devices. So if I can have one team that develops a web application, I'm going to choose to do that instead of developing a WPF app for my Windows desktop client and an Electron app for my Linux users, and a iPhone specific application with Swift or Xamarin Forms for iPhone users, and a Java based application for my Android users. So you can kind of see why businesses are trending in the direction of websites. That being said, I still really do love WPF, so I think there's value in learning it, which moves me into the next slide, which is, should I learn it? And I kept it really simple here. Do you love C#? I love C#. I have learned WPF, WinForms, Xamarin Forms, ASP.NET Core for web development, and for API development. You can run an API using Kestrel as the runtime. So you can do a lot with it. And that's because I love using C#. I would rather learn a new technology or library that uses C# than learn something other, or a different programming language. Not that you should only know one or you should only learn C#, but if you love C#, I would encourage you to learn WPF. If you want to develop desktop applications for Windows and that's your goal or a project you want to work on, I would highly suggest WPF. I think it's more modern and improved on a lot of the issues that WinForms fell short on. But if you learn one, it's really a small leap to learn the other. Do you just have extra time and want to learn something? You don't particularly care what it is. You're just looking for something out there. Then I would say, yeah, go for it. There is value in learning WPF in that case. Or is there a specific company or open source application that you know that uses WPF and you want to either position yourself to get that job or work on that open source application? Then yeah, I'll absolutely suggest it, learning it. I will say, if one of those 4 questions, your answer to those wasn't yes, you probably shouldn't learn it in that case, because WPF is not the most in-demand skill. It will, if anything, trend downward. And I don't want to scare you. I think there's a long lifespan left for WPF apps. A lot of companies use it, and they're not going to migrate their applications tomorrow. It'll be many, many years. So if they even choose to migrate, there's still very old legacy applications out there in other frameworks that almost no one knows how to develop for because everyone is retired. So there is a lot of life left in WPF. It's not the end of WPF, that's for sure. But it's not as though it's a new technology that's up and coming and going to continue to grow. I think WPF has already had its heyday, and there's a steady, consistent need for it right now. But in the next decade or so, I think it'll continue to trend down. So I think as long as there's a desire, though, there'll be support for it and new updates and etc. But if you're just getting into the industry and your answer to you didn't answer yes to any of these, then I would suggest you do not learn WPF and instead choose something else like JavaScript. Will, as far as I can tell, be in demand for many, many years, many decades, perhaps. It's hard to forecast in technology, but the idea of developing in a language that you can run and deploy applications that meet your target users' needs for any system they're on is pretty huge. Whereas, as we mentioned earlier, WPF is kind of limited in that sense. Not entirely, but it's a little harder to do some things. So yeah, that's where I would leave should you learn it. If you have specific questions or use cases that you want to ask, feel free to drop them in the comments. I will try to keep up with them and get back to you. I have personally used WPF for probably 4 years professionally. I don't use it now, and it's been years since I have used it professionally or really developed in it, period. Not because I don't enjoy using it, but different projects and different companies use different languages. And right now I'm in one of those phases that is a different framework and language, for example. But I really do still love WPF. And I'm kind of excited to break out this Hello World application in this series because it's going to force me to get back into some software development and using some WPF. I tried a few years ago to get through a streaming series using it, and I had some fun while that lasted. But yeah, the company I work for now doesn't use it as far as I'm aware. At least my team doesn't. So there hasn't been a driving need to use it. So that's where I'll leave should I learn it. And then, as I mentioned in the beginning, I had the Hello World example here, but I'm just going to speak to the plan for the series first before I get into the Hello World example. I threw this slide together with some questions that I think I would have had as a beginner with WPF, but there's a lot of info that I did not include here because I haven't fully laid out the plan for the series. I'm just going to start developing and start covering things that come up through the development process. That being said, I think there's some things that are fair to dump into some of these buckets. So I want to cover the basics, which is creating a Hello World app from scratch. It's going to be more than just presenting Hello World in a text box. We'll get that done in a matter of a few minutes. I want to walk through some things like outlining what XAML is and how to use XAML, how to create a grid and accept user input in the UI, and what code behind is. It's a phrase that you'll hear, and how data binding works. Data binding I'll touch on it in the basic part of the series, but it'll be more relevant in the MVVM bullet point when we get there, which is model, view, view model, the standard paradigm for developing WPF applications, frankly, I will say. And data binding is a key aspect of that. The next bullet point, which is database, persistent data, it's really not an intermediate topic. It can be, and there's a lot of intermediate subjects that are related to databases, but using Entity Framework and getting into that, I want to save that for that part of the series. And then the application structure. How do we actually organize our code, and what are the pros and cons? There is a basic structure, and we'll discuss that when I pull up the Hello World application here in a minute. But when you start getting into MVVM, for example, there's really a common structure that you should be using and adhering to when implementing that paradigm. So we'll save the structure for that portion. And then for the advanced topics, the first thing that came to mind was developing custom widgets. Now, what I mean specifically is there's a lot of built-in widgets that you get with WPF in XAML. You get text boxes and buttons and radio buttons and lists and all kinds of different things, and tabs and windows and everything. So those are already there. You're going to develop your custom UI with those, but you can actually develop your own widget. So let's say the button doesn't behave exactly like you want. You can develop your own button and then use that as a widget. So that is a more advanced topic, I think, probably bordering between intermediate and advanced. But that's what I'm planning to cover there. And then really anything else that we decide we want to cover throughout the series, or anyone that any questions that anyone comes up with, I will include in the advanced section in the series further down the road. And I will go back to the Hello World example, and let's see how this goes. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio. I'm using Visual Studio 2022. This will be very similar in all the other versions as well. The UI will look a little different because they changed that from release to release, but in general, you're going to open up Visual Studio, go to create a new project, and depending on what you've installed using the Visual Studio installer, you'll see different things here on the right hand side. Make sure you've installed the WPF Windows Desktop group of dependencies in the Visual Studio installer. After you've done that, you can filter on, let's filter on C#. And is there, okay, there's not a WPF option here. I've seen it in the list a couple times depending on the filtering, but I just wanted to see where the easiest way for you to find it is. So depending on what your filtering options are, they may be a little different. I won't do any filtering. Just scroll down and look for WPF. You can try searching for it as well, for example, and there's going to be a couple of options. They're not all the same, so don't click on any just yet. I mentioned earlier .NET Framework, and there were old libraries, for example, like that. That's what this is. These options are WPF Custom Control Library, and it's using the .NET Framework, and the browser app using the .NET Framework, for example. What we're looking for is just the plain old WPF application, and the tags should be C#, and depending on your version, it may also say Windows and Desktop, but make sure that the most important thing is that it's using C#, not Visual Basic, and then it doesn't say something like class library or have library in the title, just WPF application. And then once you've found that, go ahead and click next, and you can go ahead and give your application a name. We'll call ours the Hello World example, and choose where you want to install it on your computer. I have a folder for repositories, and leave this unchecked, placing solution and project in the same directory. Just for the cleanliness and the structure, I think it's preferred to leave it unchecked. This just keeps your solution file and your project files in different directories. We'll click next, and then this is where you'll choose your framework. And my options may be different than yours depending on what version you're using. You may see .NET Core or .NET Standard, Framework, etc. If you're on an older version. But right now, at the time of recording this video, .NET 8 is on LTS, or long-term support. So it's still supported, but it's really only getting security patches. And .NET 9 is the standard term support. So that's kind of the latest formal, officially released version of .NET. Either of them are totally acceptable. If you are planning to develop an application that you want to maintain for several years, I would probably go with .NET 9. I haven't looked into the differences between them as I've been out of the loop for quite a while. But in general, changing from something like .NET 8 to .NET 9 will incorporate some more features and may break a couple of things, but it's going to be pretty minimal work to migrate your application from a .NET 8 runtime to a .NET 9. But before you make the decision, I suggest you do some research on your own, look at the changelog between the two and see if there's a feature that you really need in .NET 9, for example, or something that has been broken in .NET 8, and just make the decision for yourself. But for now, either choice is fine. If you don't know what to do, but you have both, just go with .NET 9. It's the newer version, and you'll get more lifespan out of the application without having to change anything this way. So if our Hello World application lasts for a long time, then great. And I had gone ahead and already hit create, so go ahead and do that on your side. And I'm not going to do any development right now. I'm going to save that for the next video, but I wanted to familiarize you with what you're looking at and just talk about a couple things before we close out. So I have a certain way that I like using Visual Studio, just over years and years of using it, and you'll develop your own if you haven't already. So there are a few, I'll cover those in a minute. Let's just for now discuss what we're looking at as soon as we load up the application, or in the IDE. So on the right hand side is your Solution Explorer, depending on your settings. This may be somewhere else. If it is, Visual Studio is fairly customizable, and that you can click on the top of the window or tab that you want and drag it around as long as you hold it and redock it somewhere else. Personally, I like it on this part of the screen, the default area, so I'm going to leave it, but know that you can move that around. There are a lot of other buttons and stuff, but don't be super focused on those just yet. Really, the main things that we're looking for are already visible to us. This is our structure of files and dependencies on the right-hand side. So the main file, or really main 4 files, are, let's see if I can multi-highlight here, are these files: your app XAML, and then your app XAML code behind, or your app XAML C# file, and then your main window XAML and your main window code behind. Now, the reason that this is called code behind is you can see what Visual Studio is doing for us here. Technically speaking, this file that I'm highlighting is just a C# file. It could be called app.cs. The .xaml text in there is really just a standard naming practice. That way we know that this C# file is specifically tied to the app.xaml file, because really they are. That's why it's called code behind. This C# file is the code behind running that XAML file, is one way to think about it. So think another analogy maybe is this is the code that's running behind the scenes to help you with your business logic and getting data to present in a certain way in your app.xaml file. So that's why it's called code behind. And Visual Studio actually organizes the file structure for us to help us understand that. If I were to look at these files in a folder file explorer, they wouldn't be nested under each other. They're all in the same directory. But Visual Studio knows that this file name correlates to this XAML file, and it's the code behind for it. Now, we don't actually have to make any modifications to the code behind. If I just opened it here, this is ready for us. This application will run already. I have not done anything, but we have an application that will compile and run. It won't really do much, but we can run it. So let's go ahead and do that. I have a shortcut. The default is F5 on the keyboard, but to avoid using shortcuts for now, just know that this play button up here is going to compile the application and run it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on it, and you'll get a build window down here at the bottom or somewhere else on your screen that shows you the status of compiling. And because we don't have a lot of dependencies, and this is a very empty application, it is already compiled and it's running, and has been for a couple seconds at least. So you can see how quickly that happens. Now, the application window is here. This is the running application. I can click and drag it, and if I had implemented some things, I could use the application. The IDE, Visual Studio, has already attached the debugger and is showing me diagnostic information for the application. I'm getting diagnostic session info, so how long it's been running, the number of events, so break events if I set, this is live debugging, if I set a breakpoint and hit it, how much RAM I'm using, how much memory my process is using, is this stressing my CPU in any way? So this is a good thing to check when you're developing an application for end users and you need to make sure that the application is going to run on certain kinds of hardware, for example. But getting back into really the core Hello World stuff that's going on here. The application is attached to debugger, and that's why I have this little window that I can drag around here. I can click on some of these options, and feel free to poke around on your own. I clicked on Show XAML Preview, and let's see what you can do here. So Select element lets you select certain things in the screen, similar to how you would in a browser. So if you go to Chrome, you can inspect, for example, if you have developer mode enabled, I believe, and click on different widgets and actually see what part of the XAML file is going, or what part of the HTML and CSS file is going into presenting that element. And it's the same way here. I have clicked on this element and the live visual tree is showing me that this is the main window in the grid. Now, what that means is this main window.xaml file that's open here, and it should be open for you as well. This is the main, it is what it says it is, really, the main window of your application. This is where I won't say the starting point, this is where all of your content that you want to display to the user will go. Even as you add more XAML files and other windows, this is the startup pane or startup window for your application at a default. You'll see that it says the title is main window. And when I open the application back up, it says main window here. And I think I can actually change this in real time and say hello world. And without even recompiling or running, you'll see, it may be a little hard to see here, but let's see if I can zoom in for you. The XAML preview is already showing me what it's going to look like, which is a cool feature. And the application is showing hello world. So you can do some of that real-time changing. Some things won't work in real time and you'll have to recompile, and you'll figure that out as you go, and we can cover it later. But everything that's being displayed right now is really a result of this. This is a window widget that we are using, or a control element that has a lot of information baked into it. That, just think of it like a standard library widget that we're using. And there's some properties here that are pretty standard. Don't worry about them right now. Really, the most relevant thing for us is setting the title and specifying the size of the window that we want to use. So 450 pixels wide and 800 wide, 450 tall, and we have an empty grid, and that gets us this application. Now, inside this grid is where you would start adding all of your other UI elements that you want to add. The application, as it gets more complex, will have more files, and that statement won't always be true. But in general, the main Windows XAML file is the markup language describing how the application should look while it's running, and specifically how the main window should look. Now, the code behind here is, I like to stack files like this when I get multiple. So actually, let me stop the application running and open up the app XAML and clarify the difference here. So main window is your main window, the one that's presenting to the user when it boots up. App.xaml is your application resources. This actually isn't used for, you're not going to define your UI structure in your app.xaml file. You're going to define UI resources that get used in the main window XAML file. So we're not going to put our grid or anything in the app file. And right now, there's really nothing we need to do in the app file, so don't worry about it too much. This is the startup hook for your application, though, which is important. So you'll notice that it has specified the startup URI as mainwindow.xaml here. So if we wanted to change conventions and use a different file name instead of mainwindow.xaml and called it, main content.xaml, we would need to come in here and specify that we want to use main content.xaml, because this is the first part of the application that's actually going to execute. And what I mean is the code behind here is what's executing, and it's going to load these resources into memory. Then it's going to look at your startup URI and load that file, which is your presentation part of the application, and present that to the user. And then anything in the code behind here is where we would put the the data manipulation of anything that we wanted to show on the screen here. So I'm trying to avoid really digging down into too many details because I'm going to save that for when we actually start modifying this application. But to summarize, because I went around in a couple different places, the Visual Studio window that opens up after you create this project already has everything that you need there to run the Hello World example. You don't need to modify the app.xaml or its code behind, so you can minimize that if it's easier. You'll just focus on the main window XAML and main window XAML code behind for now. And really, just the main window XAML. What we can do is come in here and you'll notice that you have the XAML option for the markup, but you also have a design tab. So this is the same file, even though I'm clicking between two tabs here, this is still main window.xaml. Visual Studio provides a designer, like a UI tool that you can use for adding widgets to the screen. I personally don't like using it, especially when you start using custom widgets and things. It often doesn't work as intended. So for simple applications, it's super helpful, especially for getting a feel for it. Personally, I prefer just writing the raw XAML code myself, but if you enjoy using the designer or want to start with it, that's totally fine. You can still use both. So let's see, and you see if you right click and go to view source, you can get a split view that actually shows you the XAML code and the design that you're modifying in real time. And you can change the way it's split over here. So I personally, if I ever do this, prefer a horizontal split like this. And this is where we can add a text box with the text that just says hello world. And we'll add a self-closing tag, which is what this is if you're not familiar with any other markup language. And if we zoom in a little bit, you'll see our text was added here. And if I click on the, let's see, does it call it out for me? I thought it was going to highlight it on the screen for me, but if we want to add another text box, we can say hello, for example. And because we don't have, we're not specifying different grids and columns, these are overwriting each other. So this is where you would add a grid.column definitions, and don't worry too much about if you're not following exactly what I'm doing. I'll cover this more in depth in the when we actually start modifying a Hello World example. I just wanted to show you a couple things here. That way you can make a decision if you want to dig into it more. And in the grid definitions, I'm going to add a column definition. We'll add 2 of them, and I'll add 2 row definitions. And I will minimize those. So now I have a grid that has 2 columns and 2 rows defined, but I haven't specified where I want these text boxes to display. So you'll see I now have what look to be 2 columns and 2 rows denoted by these blue lines that the designer is helping me with. And I can choose to specify where I want these UI elements or widgets. So I'll say grid.row, and it is a 0-based indexing, which means that 0 is the first index as opposed to 1. So when I say grid.row is 0, I mean this first row here is what I want it to display in. And I'll have the grid.column as 0 as well. Now this is redundant but explicit in that if you don't clarify, it will default to row 0 and column 0. So for this one, if I wanted it there, I really wouldn't need to specify it, but for everything else you do. So it's a good convention just to do it anyways. Now I will specify row 1 and column 0 for this one. So you see hello world is up here in the first row, first column, and hello is in the second row, first column. And you can apply that and expand it into a lot more detail. You can have a lot more columns and rows, and you can have grids within grids within grids within other windows, and it can get a lot more complicated. But for now, I'm going to leave it there as that's our hello world example. We can rerun this application and just by clicking play. Really a lot easier than trying to compile with command line tools. So again, just want to hammer that point home. And you'll see that since I added text boxes to the application, I can actually modify the text in there and just type out some gibberish for now. But you can also add labels and things where the text is static and you don't want to have the user change that information. So I'll go back to my PowerPoint slideshow here and wrap up the WPF overview. So this has been Bridge Forward, where every step is a lesson, every rep is progress. Bridge Forward. Thanks for watching.